as people of faith, there are just some common questions we live with. One of them is why bad things happen to good people, and people throughout time have wrestled with this question. And when you start to dig into it, often it causes other questions to pop up. So in order to understand the world as a person who believes in God, we also have to define God, or at least what is God's character. And then once we have defined God, we might ask, why were we created? And that question can lead us down a continuing rabbit hole of other questions. And so the church has tried its best since its inception to provide answers to some of those questions. And sometimes those answers are very helpful. And sometimes those answers feel more like a parent's response of, because I said so, than a helpful answer. So in this sermon series, I'm going to be exploring some of these questions. However, if you're expecting to walk away from these sermons with firm answers, you might be a little disappointed. My goal in this sermon series is to get you thinking, to dig up those rabbit holes that we have sometimes been forbidden from going down and exploring. This will be an adventure of exploring new lands and revisiting places we maybe haven't visited in a while in our faith. I'm going to be looking at these questions from many different perspectives. Some of you might find meaning in them, and some of them you might completely disagree with. And both of those reactions are good because they make you think about the things that you truly believe in. So this week, as I said, we're talking about why bad things happen. Many of us were taught in Sunday school, or maybe just through popular culture, that God is all-powerful and always present. But when learning that, at least my mind always went to, if God can do anything, why doesn't God step in when big atrocities are happening, like the Holocaust? And many times I've been told that this is because of free will, and that explanation still holds weight in my belief system. But if we just continue to push on that question a little deeper, as I'm prone to do, we might find within that question lies a kind of unspoken belief that there is a separation between us and God. Asking why God doesn't step in means that God is a little bit removed from creation. In today's reading, we hear the psalmist describing anything but a God who is distant from us. The psalmist is claiming that there is nowhere he can go, nowhere to escape from God's presence, that God was actively taking part in his personal creation. As a knitter and crocheter myself, I absolutely love the imagery of God with knitting needles in hand, looping the fibers of our being together to create us. And when you think about it, that image is not so different from how our cells are actually duplicating and forming each new organ and body part as we grow. This is a very different image of God than many of us might carry with us. A very different image than that of a God only creating so that others would give praise. A very different image than that of an angry God waiting to rain down punishment as soon as we mess up. A very different image of God than someone who would cause fires to burn down whole communities because of some choices or political affiliations, as I have heard people claim this week. So this image of God is one that is as close to us as our very breath. Now, of course, that alone does not tell us why bad things happen, but it suggests that God may just be a little bit closer to us, including closer to us in our suffering than we may have previously thought. But I have another voice to bring into this conversation, and that is of the theologian Sallie McFague. McFague was an American feminist theologian, best known for her analysis of how metaphor lies at the heart of how Christians may speak about God. One of the metaphors she used to describe God's relationship to creation was that creation is the body of God. Now, some have claimed that her metaphor comes a little too close to pantheism, or the belief that God and the universe are the same. But she refutes that by saying that if God is to the universe, as each of us is to our bodies, then God and the world are not identical. They are, however, intimate, close, and internally related in ways that makes Christianity uncomfortable only when it forgets its incarnationalism. McFague is using this concept as a metaphor to describe God's relationship to the world. She's not equating that they are the same. Again, you may disagree with this metaphor, and I'm fine with that, but hopefully there's something to be gained by exploring it together today. McFague's whole point in thinking about this metaphor was to pull us away from the why questions we ask. We usually focus on why bad things happen. Why was I created? Why does God allow bad things to happen to me, even when I live the way God has asked me to? In this metaphor, she states that those may be the wrong questions. Instead, we should be asking where, who, and how questions. Where do I find myself? Who are my neighbors? And how can I help to create human flourishing right where I am? I was struck when reading her essay this week that those questions align almost identically to the questions the transition team will be asking in the upcoming listening sessions. Asking the why questions of our faith may be interesting, but they don't really lead anywhere definitive. But each of us are able to look around and say, where am I? What neighborhood do I live in? Who are my neighbors? Who am I surrounded by in my everyday life? And how can I use the skills I have to help those around me, including myself, to flourish? These are questions we can actually answer. And she comes to those questions through this metaphor of the world as God's body. The closeness of God spoken about in the psalm speaks to the same kind of closeness the metaphor embraces. Now, you may be thinking, okay, what does this have to do with why bad things happen? And I'm getting there. The main implication of this metaphor may be surprising, but it is that God shares God's power. God is not a puppeteer controlling us on strings. McFague compares God's power with the power that is within a living organism. And that power seeks mutual thriving. The whole does not flourish unless all parts are thriving. But when we think about the earth and all of life on it as the body of God, creating flourishing of all is messy business, especially when some natural systems are innately brutal, indifferent, and even tragic at times. If we think of a flood, for instance, some creatures are helped by the rush of water, and some are destroyed. So McFague puts those type of things in a category she refers to as natural evil, and this evil occurs frequently and for no reason. It has no drive or direction. It damages indiscriminately. But then she also states that there is a moral evil, what we would consider sin, a perversion of life, love, goodness, and truth. But she claims that neither one of those types of evil comes from God, so they hold no power of their own, but they get in the way of the mutual thriving within the body of God. Evil is never in charge, even when it feels like it is. Evil does not exist on its own. Rather, it is a perversion of good, the absence or distortion of a good that might have been. And in an incarnational reality, the world derives being from God, lives within and towards God, and is real to the extent that it reflects God. And we work out this kind of reality in our small areas of the world in which we live. We, as people of faith, derive our being from God. We live within and toward God and reflect God's reality within our neighborhoods, or we don't. When we do, we are participating in the mutual thriving within the body of God. And when we don't, we contribute to the disruption and disease within the system. In this model, the incarnation of Jesus was not something new, but a new way of God being incarnate with us. God has been with us, but through Jesus, we got to see that presence in a new way. And through Jesus, we also got to see God suffering with us in real life. And Jesus taught us that distributive justice is the key to human flourishing. If the earth is God's body, then when some parts of it are suffering, including people and places, we must care about it. And not only care, but care enough to do something about it. To be people of faith means we must recognize that each part of God's body needs to be cared for in all its diverse ways. This includes the earth and all living things. To care for the earth is to care for ourselves. To care for others is also to care for ourselves. So I know I'm not necessarily answering the why question, but I'm going to add a what question to McFague's others. We know there is suffering in the world. We know there is evil in the world. There are disasters and tragedies and conflicts all over the world. And many of those things we simply have no control over. So let's start to focus on the things we do have control over. When we see suffering in the world, let's replace the why question with a what question. What can I do about it? I'm sure many of you watched Jimmy Carter's funeral, or at least heard sound bites from it this week. Even if you are not a fan of him as president, I think most people can appreciate the good he did in the world. In his service, we heard about a man who knew the enormity of the suffering of the world and said, "What can I do about it?" After his presidency ended, he could have retired and lived a life of leisure, as many politicians do. But instead, he chose to work in nonpartisan ways to broker peace deals all over the world. He worked to end suffering from curable diseases in other countries, and he helped to build houses for his neighbors in need. In the coverage after his funeral, I saw a video clip and heard a quote from him that stuck with me. He said, "In America, if you stop somebody on the street and ask them, what are human rights? They'll say freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of worship, a democratic government. But I think there is a human right to live a decent life, to have a home in which to sleep at night, to be free of preventable diseases, to have some hope that the future will be better than the past has been, those are also human rights. And so as we think about what faith in real life looks like, I think that quote kind of sums it up. That being a person of faith means caring for God's creation. And when faced with the reality of bad things happening within that creation, we can recognize that we have the ability to help ensure that the future will be better than the past. When we ask ourselves, what can we do about it? Listen, as someone who likes to ask a lot of questions, I know this way of thinking may leave some of those why questions still on the table unanswered. And there are many questions that I can't wait to ask once my time on earth has ended. But until then, let us live as followers of Christ and believers in the goodness of God. Let us walk as those who are known by God completely. And in those times that we feel like God is distant or uncaring, let us remember the psalmist's words. In your book were written all the days that were formed for me, when none of them as yet existed. How weighty to me are your thoughts, O God. How vast the sum of them. I try to count them. They are more than the sand. I come to the end. I am still with you. Amen.